Welcome to Sword and Shield, the official podcast of the 960th Cyberspace Wing. Join us for insight, knowledge, mentorship, and some fun as we discuss relevant topics in and around our wing. Please understand that the views expressed in this podcast are not necessarily the views of the U.S. Air Force nor the Air Force Reserve, and no endorsement of any particular person or business is ever intended.
Good day, Gladiators. Thank you for joining us for another episode of our Sword and Shield podcast. It's Francis Martinez, Director of Psychological Health for the 960th Cyberspace Wing, here with two very special guests. I'll let you guys introduce yourselves.
I'm Master Sgt. Chandler Walker, the Exercise Coordinator for the Inspector General of the 960th Cyber Wing.
And I'm Amy Jane Walker, who is his spouse, and as of December, an American.
Yeah, Amy Jane, congratulations. So that's why we wanted to have you guys on today. I think there are so many, misconceptions when it comes to marrying an immigrant and what the immigration process looks like, and the fears of I can't because of my security clearance, or the challenges. And so that's kind of what we wanted to talk about today. And just so listeners know, this is their personal experience, right? All experiences are going to be very different. The visa process is very different. And it also depends on what countries you come from and things like that. So personal experience story. So why don't we get started and talk a little bit about how you guys met, where that was, what that looked like?
So we met in Korea. I was stationed there back in 2015. Amy Jane happened to be teaching English.
And we met on online dating because that's the only way to find someone that speaks English in Korea. Yeah.
So we lived about an hour apart, but we started dating. And by the time my time in Korea was coming up, my year, her contract was also coming up. And
he asked me to move in with him to a different continent.
Well, let's put a pause because it doesn't sound like you have a Korean accent. So, where are you from?
I'm from South Africa. I was teaching English in Korea because there are 6 countries that are allowed to teach English in Korea, and South Africa is one of them.
Gotcha.
So yeah, I asked her to come to the States with me. So we started doing the process probably about 3 months out from coming to the States of getting her visa and everything.
Which I came in on a tourist visa because if I were to come in on a fiancé visa, then we'd have to be married within
90 days.
90
like
days.
The show.
Yeah.
And at that time, I liked this man. I didn't know if I was, let's get married in 90 days, like this man. So I came in as a tourist visa because that gave us at least 6 months to live together, and then either I would have to leave the country again or we'd have to figure it out.
Yeah. So when we came to the States, and we were married within 3 months. So we decided to get married, and I hadn't really thought about too much regarding citizenship, green card, permanent residency, or even my security clearance for that matter. It was just kind of
we knew that we liked each other enough that we wanted to stay together.
Mm-hmm.
So once we finally got married, we started looking into the process a lot more, which it was daunting.
And quickly became overwhelmed.
What did that look like? Where did you guys start? What did that look like for you guys?
Google. Honestly, it was literally just Google search after Google search trying to find where to start.
Mm-hmm.
And it is convoluted because there are so many different forms. So trying to figure out which is the right one you're meant to fill out. And then we started looking at immigration lawyers, and we realized how expensive so many of those are. And we tried to find, I know that there's some churches that help up with the application process, but I don't know, we just struggled to find one. So we ended up having to do it all mostly on our own.
So even reaching out to like military resources, what did that look like?
So being in JBSA,
Mhm.
that was the only benefit we had because of Fort Sam Houston. They have with the the Army medical training happening there. They have a very heavy influx of immigrants that are military members trying to get citizenship. So they do have a pretty regular resource that you can actually ask questions. They don't really help too much aside from informationally, but
they can at least tell you which of the forms you're meant to fill out. And if you bring everything in, they can tell you if you're on the right track.
Gotcha.
Yeah. But we were told that there were lawyers that would help us.
So we did see that JAG on paper can help with immigration. However, none of them would touch even looking at our documents.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's because it was a spouse rather than a military member or what the reason was, but we got zero help from JAG, unfortunately.
Even though everyone kept telling us that they would help, none of them actually knew anything or could help us or were willing to. I don't know their reasons, but we got turned down.
It is a very specific path for a lawyer, from what I can understand.
Mm-hmm.
The process, though, with everything starts at USCIS. I don't remember the acronym off the top of my head what that stands for, but the website isn't exactly cut and dry. It's a lot more difficult than just reading an AFI. If you're familiar with DoD regulations and stuff, they become very, very hard to read, and that's closer to what their guidance looks like. So finding the documents, like she said, knowing which ones to fill out, knowing how a military member is different than a regular U.S. citizen, and knowing how a U.S. citizen bringing in a spouse is different than a U.S. citizen possibly bringing in a naturalized citizen bringing in family.
What did you find the differences were, like a civilian person trying to have someone come versus a military member having someone?
A lot of people told us it would be easier, but I feel it was exactly the same process, at least compared to. I have a friend who's Sri Lankan. I met her in Korea, and she has now also married an American and is now living in Georgia. And we're very close, and she's working on her citizenship. So we compare a lot of notes, and she's married to a civilian. So and
it seems very similar. The only difference that we really were able to pick out is a foreign citizen married to a U.S. citizen is able to cut down from a 5-year minimum permanent residency down to 3 years. One fun fact that we found out is if you get married and then you apply for permanent residency, within 2 years of that marriage, there's a 2-year window of conditions, essentially. Mm-hmm. So she couldn't leave the country for more than a certain amount of time. I think it was 30 days.
I was a conditional resident, and then I had to apply to become an unconditional resident.
Which that was...
Where there's no stipulations or anything, right?
Right. And you have to get those conditions removed before you can apply for citizenship.
And we had to go to an interview where they assessed us as a couple, which that was actually fantastic because we walked in there and we were our usual selves. Like, I'd worked myself into a little bit of a panic, me like, what color is his toothbrush?
I've been married to my husband almost 22 years, and I don't even know what color his toothbrush is, right?
It changes.
Yeah, it does. It should change if you have the same one for that long.
Yeah. And I did not need to panic because she was like, no, you guys are clearly a couple. And it was a normal conversation and then she got to tell us about all of the horror stories that some couples have brought in information to prove that they're married of explicit content.
So, like, what was that feeling like, that process of knowing you have to go do all these things to prove that you guys really are a couple, right? Because sometimes you don't want to overdo it because you don't want to seem like it's, forced or fake or anything like that versus, trying to just being underwhelmed with stuff. So what was that like?
So back to our friend a little bit. She's worried a lot about, oh, we don't have enough pictures. We need to make sure we have plenty of pictures. We're the exact opposite. We live in the now. We just kind of exist and have fun, right?
My mother took a lot of photos of me growing up, so I don't like photos, and I do not post on Facebook. So we have very little evidence of us being a couple still to this day, other than
Social evidence.
Yeah,
Yeah.
of like at least physically, like on Facebook, or so we had to rely on a lot of our friends had to write letters saying that they knew us and how long they'd known us for, and how they interacted with us, saying like vouching for us as a couple.
Mhm.
We got a lot of people to do letters because we didn't have an album. And when we got married, we had 2 witnesses. That was his father and my mother. So we didn't have a big wedding.
And you guys got married here in the States, right?
Yes.
Yeah, we were actually here in San Antonio. We got married by
The grotto in the Riverwalk.
on the Riverwalk by a EOD tech that happened to be a ordained humanist chaplain. So it was kind of cool getting married by somebody in my old career field.
Yeah.
Yeah. So honestly, it started off kind of daunting of like, oh, we have to have all this proof, and we're, like I said, we're terrible about taking all these pictures.
So we were quite panicked, and then we walked in there, and the interviewer was lovely, and she was like, "No, you guys are clearly a couple. The way you interact, like." So all of the panic melted away very quickly.
Yeah, and then we just ended up with a lot of lack of communication between us and USCIS after she got her green or her permanent residency card.
I think our big issue and one of the struggles with being married to a military member is we move. And when you move, your USCIS office moves. So you have to apply and change all of your addresses. And just because you change your address on the website does not mean they've changed the address.
We found that out the hard way when somebody got a letter from here, and we were able to actually get it forwarded to us, and it was 3 months out of date, and we were supposed to be in office. We were supposed to have an appointment or something, and having to reschedule it now in Miami rather than in San Antonio was a burden. And on top of that, not all offices are equal. JBSA or San Antonio in general has a really solid office. They're actually a testing unit, and they examine processes and make sure that the process is more efficient than previous.
While I feel the Miami office is overwhelmed. Yeah, and it was a struggle to get information from them, and I actually ended up having, what was the name of that interview?
I don't remember.
Was it the citizenship? Yes, it was. I had my citizenship interview / test, and I didn't have a form. It hadn't been processed yet, even though I had handed in the form to be processed to Miami 2 years previously.
Oh yeah, no, the removal of conditions.
Yes. But when I gave it into the office, COVID struck.
Oh no, yeah.
So everything ground to a halt, and clearly mine just stayed at the bottom of the pile. Because it was the San Antonio office. She was like, I'm not meant to do the interview now, but because I'm a testing office, we can change things around. We don't have to be as rigid. So we did the interview, and then she got the paperwork from Miami and then processed it here. And then only after that was I able to become a citizen and get my...
Do the oath?
Yes, have my oath ceremony.
Backtracking a little bit. So with the removal of conditions, that was an interesting process. So when we sent off the paperwork for that, we got a letter in the mail saying that her permanent resident card had been extended for 18 months. So according to the card, it was expired. if we card plus letter from USCIS made the card valid again. Me not understanding how, not realizing that that was an expiration date only for the card, and kind of like a driver's license has expiration date. It was only saying that that card was going to expire and travel would be more difficult now.
Yeah, I was still a legal resident, but it was only the card. It wasn't the legal residency that had expired.
And it's not clear
Yeah.
and we could have probably found it had we really looked hard, but I didn't find it in my quick searches for it.
So was there a little bit of panic?
There was a lot of bit of panic. Because my security clearance was coming up for reinvestigation, and I hold the top secret.
And I decided to stop driving because I just didn't want to be pulled over and questioned. So I'm just like, we can let him drive. Like, if anything happens, it's on him then. Like,
so I was concerned because I was like, well, is my wife illegal now? And one of the questions on your security clearance is, have you ever helped an illegal immigrant into the country? And I'm like, I mean, my wife's about to expire on her permanent residency, so I mean, technically, yes. Like, and
but it wasn't true.
It wasn't accurate, and unfortunately, the investigator also didn't know this, like how it all works, because it's not incredibly common. So going through that, I was extremely stressed, and I went from having basically a periodic review of them being like, "Have you broken the law lately?" And I'm like, "No," and then they give me my clearance, right?
And then I came along and confused everything.
Yes, I broke the law.
Well, now I have, 10 foreign nationals, several of which have served in foreign militaries because conscription's a thing in South Africa.
Well, it was. It no longer is a thing. Yes. But during a certain time period, if you were a male of a certain age, you were part of the military. So all of my uncles served in the military for at least 2 years because they had to. And so they ping, well, at least they no longer ping because they've now been investigated, but they pinged on his security clearance that we had to talk about them. It wasn't an issue, but it was someone that we had to bring up. And my family likes to roam the world, so it's not just, oh, it's this group of people in this country, it's, oh, so-and-so's in Thailand, and so-and-so's in New Zealand, and this uncle's over here, and it's, have fun finding them.
How do we become a part of your family?
It makes travel fantastic.
Always have somewhere to stay.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so this was the first time, other than when I initially got my clearance, that everybody was called. My dad was called again. My sister was called again. Her mom was contacted, and just everybody who was on there was contacted basically. And so it was worrisome because while I trust that everybody is going to tell me the truth, who knows what they may have forgotten or may have inadvertently left out of their life story to me.
Yeah, there was just that new worry that he didn't think he'd have to worry about.
But luckily my clearance was adjudicated and everything's fine. But that was a huge concern at one stage that I never really considered until it was a thing. And I think I stressed way more than I needed to about it because of not knowing the answers.
Yeah. Do you guys feel like the whole process is more difficult because of, a lot of the fraudulent cases? Do you think that they kind of look at it differently, or would you say that it was pretty standard process?
So looking at some other countries' processes, I think ours is a little bit more convoluted.
Yeah.
Honestly, it's more daunting than I can going through it with Amy Jane. I can actually look at it now and say, I understand why there's people who avoid it, because there's a lot of uncertainty in the whole process.
Yeah, we did everything legally, but we joked about just not doing anything and hiding me in a closet type thing for a while, just because at times it just felt so overwhelming. Yeah.
And the process isn't cheap by any means.
Mm-hmm. I think that's another part, depending on what type of visa you're doing, and then the sponsorship piece. And so what did that look like for you guys?
So the visa part wasn't too bad. I think it was a pretty small fee, less than $100 probably. I can't remember. That was quite some time back.
And that because I was in Korea at the time, so I went through the Korean embassy to get my visa. So
the U.S. Embassy in Korea.
Yes, the U.S. Embassy in Korea.
The initial cost for the application was like $1,400 initially, and then the removal of conditions is another $700-800. And then there's biometric fees because they go on to get your fingerprints and make sure you are who you are. And then there's what was the other? And then the N400 is the form you fill out for citizenship, and that one is another $400 or $500. So it just adds up real quick. And if you throw in a lawyer, you're at least doubling it.
Oh yeah.
And in many cases, it might be more. So it's
a long, daunting process.
Yes.
It's expensive, and you're very feeling uncertain and uneasy, I'm sure, going through everything and not knowing what the outcome will eventually be.
Yeah.
But you're here with us today.
And we made it through, and so far we still like each other.
Well, that's a plus.
Right?
That's a plus.
For some reason.
But I do want to, again, congratulate you on your citizenship. I know that came in sometime December, right?
Yes. Which, that was a wait and then panic at the last minute because we
hadn't gotten the letter because it was delivered only days prior to. And as San Antonio likes to do, the mailbox is away from the house.
So it doesn't get checked every day.
And let's be honest, 90% of what you get in the mail nowadays is junk mail because everything's online anymore. So
it slipped through the cracks, and then
the day of, we got a phone call of them saying, "Hey, is your wife in the country?" And I was like, "Yeah, she should be at home." And they're like, "Well, she missed her appointment this morning to take her oath." And then he said, "Can you guys be here
before
2?" And so I called up my supervisor and I said, "Hey, my wife's getting her citizenship today. Can I cut out and shout out to Senior Master Sergeant Reagan Green?" She was like, "Of course, do it. Have fun."
Sorry guys, you gotta wait till
I was still asleep at that stage, and he called me, and I was like, "I'm sorry, what?" Okay, it's happening now. Fantastic. But we got to video chat all of our family, so they got to watch the ceremony.
Oh, that's amazing.
Which they've changed the ceremony now, because it used to be like 3,000 people or whatever, and now because of COVID, they're much smaller ceremonies.
We had 3 people swearing in that day, all 3 of which were military members.
Well, except me.
Well, military adjacent, at least.
Well, thank you guys so much for joining me today, and congratulations again, Amy Jane, on your citizenship, and then just your love story. We've had the chance to talk before about a couple things, and just congratulations overall on sticking with each other and getting through sometimes difficult times. Really put a light on what is going on, and you guys got something good going on.
And there is hope. You can do it without a lawyer. Read things carefully.
And just a reminder, again, your story is going to be very different, right, than the next person's story. But sometimes just hearing stuff and like, oh yeah, I went through that, or someone that might be starting the process and having some understanding of, hey, let me start here. So thanks for sharing.
Honestly, some of those resources, like Fort Sam having their, I think, quarterly immigration seminars, like that was where we started, and that was key. So.
Well, thanks guys for sharing your story today. If you guys are listening and are needing any assistance, please let me know and we will point you in the right direction. Gladiators, have a good rest of your week, and Gladiators out.